The tension inside courtroom 7B of the New York Federal Courthouse was so thick it could be cut with a knife, as every eye shifted to the tall, sharply dressed billionaire seated smugly at the defendant's table, arms crossed, legs stretched arrogantly before him. A self-satisfied grin etched across his chiseled face like he had already won. Vincent Langford, age 52, founder of Langford Technologies and one of America's most controversial tech moguls, had swaggered in wearing a navy blue Brioni, suit in $2,000 leather loafers, refusing to remove his sunglasses and ignoring the court officer's direction to stand as Judge Amar Bell, a poised, commanding black woman in her early 40s with a Harvard law degree and a reputation for unflinching integrity, entered the chamber, her presence both dignified and magnetic in her black robes as she surveyed the courtroom with practiced calm. Murmurs rippled among the audience, journalists, legal interns, and social activists alike, witnessing the showdown between corporate arrogance and judicial authority, a confrontation that had been anticipated ever since Langford's indictment for insider trading, worker exploitation, and racial discrimination in hiring practices, though he dismissed the charges as media noise and accused the prosecution of woke bullying. As Judge Bell took her seat and the courtroom rose, everyone but Langford, her gaze landed squarely on the defendant, her deep brown eyes steady and unreadable as she asked in an even tone, "Mr. Langford, do you intend to remain seated in defiance of this court's decorum?" To which Langford replied, grinning and leaning back, "Some judges need to learn their place," sending gas across the room and prompting one of his lawyers to flinch in disbelief, while others exchanged glances of discomfort at his brazen disrespect. Bell, unfazed, took a slow breath, folded her hands, and said, "Noted," before moving forward with the proceedings, her composure only heightening the weight of her authority. And though Langford whispered jokes to his attorney and checked his Rolex repeatedly, it became evident that he was underestimating the storm brewing around him. In chambers the day before, prosecutors had gathered damning testimonies from former employees, mostly women and minorities, who described Langford's pattern of verbal abuse, sudden terminations, and suppression of internal complaints, all buried under high-priced NDAs and intimidation tactics. Still, his legal team, headed by the cutthroat and silver-tongued defense attorney Marcus Cray, remained confident, banking on Langford's public image and their extensive influence in media circles to turn the case into a circus of deflection and performative outrage. What no one expected, however, was Judge Bell's patience, strategic, razor-sharp, and unshaken, as she let Langford's ego inflate in the spotlight, waiting for the perfect moment to pivot. Throughout the session, she allowed his interruptions, smirks, and subtle mockery of the court authority to accumulate, recording every instance while the jury took note. And by the time court adjourned for the day, with reporters circling outside like vultures, Langford exited like a celebrity, tossing off sound bites to cameras like, "She should be thanking me for showing up," further enraging the public. But back inside the courthouse, Judge Bell was meeting with federal investigators, going over a sealed document that included digital communications between Langford and a key whistleblower, an email thread that had been leaked anonymously just days before, revealing his plan to frame a former employee for data leaks that had never occurred, and worse, explicit racial slurs that shattered the defense's narrative of innocence. In that moment, Bell knew what she had to do, not just as a judge, but as a black woman in power, conscious of the weight her presence carried in a space so often stacked against people like her, and with quiet conviction, she began to orchestrate what would become one of the most talked about judicial reckonings in recent history, not with shouting or grand gestures, but with methodical precision, unimpeachable evidence, and the knowledge that the higher he climbed in his arrogance, the farther he was about to fall. After Anthony Wycliffe's arrogant defiance in front of Judge Maya Rowe, tension was rising in the courtroom, but the heavy wooden door to courtroom 3B swung shut with a soft thud that seemed to close off the outside world. It also silenced the stunned people inside as the gavel echoed once more to restore order. Judge Rowe didn't flinch, blink, or look away. Her deep brown eyes were fixed on Wycliffe, who was sitting in the defendant's chair with one leg crossed over the other and a faint smile on his face that almost begged for a fight. Clad in a custom three-piece Italian suit of Royal Navy silk, a silver tie glinting under the court's recessed lighting, his meticulously combed blonde hair and smug expression exuded a man far too familiar with getting his way and far too dismissive of anyone who didn't reflect his wealth or skin color. "Mister," This court requires decorum. Judge Rowe began in a measured but firm tone. It is not optional to stand in recognition of the court. It is fundamental. Her tone didn't rise, but the subtle force behind her words made even the stenographer glance up from her machine. And as for your earlier comment, she continued, eyes narrowing just a touch, some judges do not forget who they are, no matter what you believe their place to be. The billionaire gave a theatrical yawn, brushing a speck of lint from his lapel, as if her words were a breeze to swat away, and the moment was not lost on the packed courtroom. On the front row, seated just behind the prosecution table, was U.S. Latina powerhouse attorney Dana Salazar pierced Wycliffe's skull with daggers and had sharper instincts than anyone else. She leaned over to whisper something into her assistant's ear, something about preparing the exhibits and requesting security enhancement for witness testimony, while Judge Rowe turned her attention to the formal reading of the charges. Wycliffe was indicted on 5 federal charges, including securities fraud, insider trading, and obstruction of justice. These charges were all connected to a multi-state scheme that had wiped out the pension funds of thousands of people across the country, including firefighters in Ohio, teachers in Georgia, and retired veterans in Arizona. However, Wycliffe appeared amused by the process even as formal court proceedings resumed, as if everyone present was simply participating in a ruse designed for his amusement. Agent Marcus Green, the lead federal investigator, was summoned to testify, and his composed demeanor and sharp black suit added weight to the room. A black man in his early 40s, with military-cut fade and scars on his knuckles that hinted at a past not entirely bureaucratic, Green laid out the facts with calm precision. Emails tracing insider tips to Wycliffe's private account, shell corporations in the Caymans, encrypted messages retrieved through an international sting that even involved cooperation from Japanese cybercrime units. Wycliffe's defense attorney, the equally smug Terrence Gable, known for defending the elite with theatrical flair, tried to interrupt multiple times, objecting on ground to hearsay and scope, but Judge Rowe overruled him with polite efficiency. Mr. Gable, if you persist in interrupting sworn testimony with unfounded objections, I will hold you in contempt, she said without raising her voice. For the first time, Gable's smirk faltered. Meanwhile, Wycliffe kept glancing at his platinum wristwatch, clearly counting down to something. Not a verdict, perhaps, but favor and intervention, or the arrival of one of the many influential people he believed owed him loyalty. The court recessed briefly for lunch, and outside the courthouse, protesters had begun gathering, victims of Wycliffe's schemes holding signs that read, "I lost my retirement," and "Wall Street is not above the law." Inside the judge's chambers, Maya Rose sat alone, sipping lukewarm coffee as she reread the day's testimony. A framed photo on her desk showed her and her father, an Army veteran who raised her alone, standing outside Howard University Law School the day she graduated. She rubbed the edge of the photo frame gently with her thumb. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. Chief Justice Harold Langford, a wiry, sharp-eyed, older white man who had been in charge of the district for nearly 3 decades, was the one who was responsible. "Maya," he said as he stepped in, closing the door behind him, "there's pressure mounting. The Wycliffe family has lawyers calling the circuit court, senators making veiled comments about judicial overreach. I'm just letting you know. Don't let it shake you." Maya stood, her posture impeccable even when no one was watching. She stated simply, "I won't." He treated this bench and institution with disrespect. "I won't let his money change what it means to be just." Langford nodded slowly, studying her with an expression that hovered between admiration and concern. "Just watch your back," he said, before slipping out. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session began with surprise motion from the prosecution, a request to introduce wiretap audio from one of Wycliffe's yacht parties, recorded under court-approved warrants, where he could be heard bragging about playing the feds like fiddles and joking about how even if he gets indicted, the judge will bow or be buried. The moment the clip played, every camera in the courtroom froze on Judge Rowe. Her eyes darkened, but not out of rage, but out of clarity, as if everything had suddenly clicked. Her face remained calm, but something about her expression changed. Wycliffe didn't even deny the voice on the tape. He whispered something that made the lawyer frown as he leaned over him. The reporters were writing faster than ever. The gallery murmured loudly, and the bailiffs were nervous about being interrupted. Maya turned to the jury and spoke in a voice that resonated with a force no amplification system could match. Let the record show this defendant does not merely disregard the rule of law. He mocks its very foundation, she said. But in this courtroom, under this Constitution, justice does not yield to wealth or arrogance. She adjourned for the day, and as the attendees filed out, Wycliffe remained seated, unmoved. His assistant approached, whispering that the PR fallout was spreading like wildfire, with news networks replaying the judge's quote across every channel. Nonetheless, he did not appear concerned. "Don't worry," he said coolly. "By tomorrow, she'll be off the bench, or she'll wish she was." Little did he know, the real trial had just begun, not just in the courtroom, but in the halls of power where his influence had long gone unchecked. As night fell and the courthouse stood silent under a slate-gray sky, Judge Maya Rowe sat in her office, her fingers drumming slowly on a folder marked "Confidential" DOJ briefing. Whatever was coming next, she was ready, and Anthony Wycliffe was about to learn that not every woman with power can be bought, bullied, or broken. A legal slugfest that had begun with a smirk and a refusal to stand, but was now threatening to unravel the very myth of untouchable white-collar power. Inside courtroom 3B, the air felt electric, thick with the weight of everything that had been before. Wycliffe's brazen disrespect, the wiretap audio that mocked not only the legal process but also Judge Maya Rowe herself, and the mounting evidence that painted a picture of a man whose A.R. Elijah Carter, a 28-year-old black software engineer, with a lean frame and sharp eyes, took the stand cautiously, glancing briefly at Wycliffe, who raised an eyebrow in recognition, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. As U.S. Attorney Dana Salazar rose and approached the witness box, her heels clicking with purpose on the polished floor, a thick folder in her arms labeled Project Kepler. Internal correspondence. What followed was a chilling revelation. Elijah had once worked directly under Wycliffe at Langford Technologies as a junior developer, tasked with building code for what was then touted as a revolutionary AI-driven investment platform. But as he described in detail, the platform's core algorithm had been deliberately manipulated to pump and dump stock valuations by artificially inflating market signals before dumping the investments just before real-time corrections hit, the digital equivalent of financial sabotage, masked under the illusion of smart trading. And when Elijah had discovered the anomaly and reported it to the senior dev team, he was quietly terminated within 48 hours, handed a fabricated underperformance memo, and given a severance agreement with a suffocating NDA clause. Wycliffe leaned forward, visibly agitated now, his hands clenching around the edges of the table as Elijah read aloud one of the internal emails from a company's Slack channel, leaked through a protected source and now displayed on the courtroom projector. "Keep the geek quiet. His kind's always looking for a payout." Audible gasps filled the room, and even the stenographer paused for a split second. Judge Rowe, expression composed but stern, instructed the jury to disregard their reactions and focus on the facts, though she herself felt a white-hot burn of 1,000 moments of racial condescension that every woman like her had endured on her way to the bench. Wycliffe's attorney, Terrence Gable, scrambled to object, citing lack of authenticity and privacy violations, but Rowe shot him down with a single sentence. "Mr." As Elijah stepped down from the witness box, the gallery broke into brief, uncontrollable applause, which was immediately silenced by a sharp rap of the gavel. Judge Rowe ordered the bailiffs to restore order and call for a 10-minute recess, during which whispers buzzed like flies. "Did you see his face?" The testimony of that engineer was brutal. "He's losing control," Rowe said, and Rowe threw a quiet, calculated curveball when he summoned 2 United States. The shift was unmistakable. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a cultural reckoning, and Judge Rowe, once just another name on a docket, was being hailed as a quiet force of justice, a woman whose refusal to react emotionally had become her greatest weapon. Meanwhile, Wycliffe's legal team started to fracture under pressure. Internal tension spilled into whispered arguments and sharp glances, while the billionaire himself became visibly U.S. Judge Maya Rowe reminded everyone present, including the millions watching the live stream, that tomorrow would include testimony from one final surprise witness whose identity had been kept confidential for their protection. Wycliffe, no longer smirking, stared straight ahead as if trying to anticipate what would fall next, But Judge Maya Rowe gave him nothing. Not a glance, not a word, only silence, pregnant with purpose, as she rose on the bench with calm authority. And this time, even the billionaire finally stood. The fourth day of the trial arrived under a sky streaked with ash-gray clouds, and yet the courthouse steps were more crowded than ever, as if the collective sense of reckoning had drawn not just protesters and press, but ordinary people who had never before cared about corporate trials. Mothers clutching newspaper clippings of ruined pensions, veterans in uniform with signs reading "Not above the law," and even young tech workers who had once idolized Wycliffe, now holding banners condemning his empire's betrayal. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with attention, so refined it was almost silent, every seat filled, every breath held, as the world awaited the identity of the final witness whose sealed testimony had been whispered about for days. Anthony Wycliffe sat in a noticeably stiff posture now, his designer suit pristine, but his composure fraying at the edges, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, jaw clenched in anticipation of the unknown, as even his once cocky lawyer, Terence Gable, tapped his pen nervously on the desk, his bravado drained by the cascade of damning revelations. And then, like a thread being pulled through time, the moment arrived. Judge Maya Rowe, regal and focused, called the next witness with a voice that needed no amplification, only gravity. The court calls Diana Merrill to stand, and when the doors opened and the woman entered, the room did not gasp, it exhaled, a collective recognition of the name, a name once buried in a forgotten lawsuit, but now spoken into the world with the weight of truth. Diana Merrill, a former senior financial officer at Langford Technologies, had disappeared from the public 5 years earlier after a sudden and mysterious resignation, followed by a quiet non-disclosure settlement that had left even investigative journalists at a dead end. But now she stepped forward with poise, dressed modestly in a navy blouse and slacks, her graying braids pinned back, her face calm but weathered by years of silence, and, as she took the oath, the energy in the courtroom shifted again. Wycliffe leaned forward in his chair, hands clenched around the edge of the table, and even Gable whispered sharp, "We didn't know she was coming." What followed was not a performance, not a media stunt, but a surgical dismantling of a house of corruption, as Diana laid bare the blueprint of Langford's deception. The fake shell firms, the ghost employees used to mask racial pay disparities, the rigged performance review system that filtered out minorities for promotions, and the personal directives from Wycliffe himself, signed in his hand, that instructed legal to settle quietly and erase records whenever HR flagged discrimination claims. At one point, she held up a printed email dated 6 years ago, in which Wycliffe wrote to his executive board, "Perception is everything. So keep the diversity for the brochures, not the boardroom." And even the jurors, trained to remain impassive, exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. Judge Rowe, ever composed, allowed the testimony to flow, interrupting only to clarify key points for the record, but the fire behind her eyes betrayed the righteous fury she'd been holding since day one. Wycliffe's legal team scrambled to object, to suppress, to delay, but Rowe had seen every game in the book, and one by one, she denied them, citing precedent and judicial authority with the ease of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, and just when it seemed the day's revelations couldn't. Go deeper. Diana paused, opened a small manila envelope, and slid a single flash drive across the witness stand. A drive that contained video recordings from an internal compliance server, captured by accident, never deleted, and never meant to be seen. In one, Wycliffe is caught on a hot mic during a board retreat saying, "Black judges love the theater of power," but all it takes is one phone call to remind them who runs this country. The courtroom froze, like time itself had stopped too. Register the impact of those words, and Maya Rowe, for the first time in the entire trial, closed her eyes for just a heartbeat, not out of shock, but out of something deeper, a sorrow that someone could be so casually cruel and so arrogantly certain that the system would always protect him. When she opened her eyes again, there was a stillness in her expression that frightened even Wycliffe, a stillness born not of rage, but of resolve. She thanked the witness, allowed cross-examination, and let Gable flail helplessly as he tried to challenge her credibility. But Diana stood unshaken, refusing to be discredited by the same legal team that once silenced her. When she stepped down, the gallery stood in silent tribute, and this time, Judge Rowe did not stop them. She let the moment stretch unbroken, before finally nodding and calling the day's session to a close. But before she rose from her bench, She turned to the fence and issued a final, quiet pronouncement. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. I advise the defense to prepare not with strategy, but with honesty, because this bench no longer tolerates the currency of arrogance. And as she stood, Anthony Wycliffe, who once refused to rise, now stood slowly without being told, his face pale and unreadable, because he finally understood that power was no longer something he could wield. It was something he had to answer to. The final day of the trial arrived like the conclusion to a slow-building storm, inevitable, electrified, and impossible to ignore, as helicopters hovered in the hazy Manhattan sky. Camera crews jockeyed to position outside the courthouse, and barricades were reinforced to hold back the growing wave of onlookers, activists, and media, all drawn not by spectacle, but by the gravitas of justice in motion. Inside courtroom 3B, now the most watched room in the country, the mood was tense but reverent. The spectators hushed, the jurors attentive, and the atmosphere punctuated by the faint hum of television equipment recording history in real time. Anthony Wycliffe, the once untouchable billionaire whose empire had been built on a cocktail of tech disruption, media manipulation, and veiled bigotry, sat rigid in his chair, not with defiance this time, but with the demeanor of a man cornered by a truth he could no longer dismiss. The smirk that had once defined him now erased, replaced by the slow, dawning realization that the world had changed around him and left him behind. Beside him, his attorney Terence Gable flipped through a final set of notes, though the weight of defeat hung heavy on his shoulders. His courtroom bravado long since dissolved under the relentless tide of evidence, witness testimony, and the undeniable moral authority of Judge Maya Rowe, who entered the courtroom that morning with the same composed confidence she had carried from the first gavel strike. Her black robe flowing like armor, her short, natural curls silhouetted by the soft morning light pouring through the high windows, and her face solemn yet calm, as if she already knew that what was about to unfold was not merely a verdict, but a statement to history. The courtroom rose in silence, not a command, but an instinct, as she took her seat, and for the first time, Wycliffe stood fully and respectfully, not because he wanted to, but because he knew he could no longer afford not to. And that simple act, meaningless on day one, now landed with the force of confession. As closing arguments began, U.S. Attorney Dana Salazar rose with controlled intensity, her voice measured and sharp as she wove together the narrative that had emerged over 5 harrowing days. A man who abused power, mocked justice, silenced truth, and enriched himself while those beneath him suffered. A man who believed he could say and do anything with impunity, because no one had ever told him no, and made it stick until now. She invoked the testimonies of whistleblowers like Elijah Carter, the buried evidence from Diana Merrill, the racist recordings that no amount of spin could reframe, and the trail of financial devastation left behind like footprints through shattered lives. Salazar's final words echoed to the room. This is not just about one man. It's about whether this nation's justice system still bends to power or finally stands up to it. When Gable stood for the defense, he tried to pivot, claiming bias, suggesting media hysteria, even insinuating political motives. But the momentum was gone, the jury unmoved, and the gallery visibly disgusted by his hollow deflections. After both sides rested, Judge Rowe gave the jury their instructions with clarity and gravity, her voice steady as she reminded them of the law, of their duty, and of the sacred responsibility they held in their hands. Deliberations lasted only 3 hours, but they felt like days, until the bailiff re-entered and passed a folded slip to the clerk, who read the verdict aloud. On all counts guilty. The words rang like church bells, final and irreversible, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent, not with shock, but with reverence, as Anthony Wycliffe sank slowly into his chair, his eyes blank, his mouth slack, as though he had just been yanked from the fantasy he had lived in all his life and thrown into the world the rest of them knew too well. Judge Rowe thanked the jury, dismissed them, and then turned her gaze on the defendant, not with vindictiveness, but with solemn purpose. As she began the sentencing phase, her voice carrying not just the weight of the law, but the resolve of every person who had been silenced by wealth, dismissed by arrogance, or forgotten by a system that too often traded justice for influence. She sentenced Wycliffe to 27 years in federal prison, plus restitution of over $400 million to affected victims, including specific reparative funds for the communities disproportionately harmed by his discriminatory business practices. And as she concluded, She looked directly at him and said, "You once told your investors that no one could touch you. Let this courtroom be the place where that lie ends." The courtroom erupted in a spontaneous, standing ovation, not one encouraged by her, but one she allowed just this once, because she understood that justice needed witnesses. Outside, the scene was jubilant. Crowds cheering, people weeping, reporters declaring it the most significant corporate accountability ruling of the decade. And in the center of it all, Judge Rowe emerged not with celebration, but with dignity, flanked by court officers and a sea of supporters, her head held high not for herself, but for the bench, the robe, and the principle that had guided her every decision. A young girl in the crowd, maybe 11 years old, held up a sign that read, "I want to be like her." And when Maya saw it, she allowed herself a small smile, the only one she had worn all week, because in that moment, she knew the impact of her integrity had rippled beyond the walls of the courtroom and into the lives of those still coming up behind her. As for Wycliffe, he was let out in cuffs, no special treatment, no backdoor exit, just a man undone by the very truth he had tried to bury, now facing the consequences he had once laughed at. And so, in a courthouse built by hands long dead, overseen by laws long written, a powerful man fell not by force, but by the will of the system rediscovering its spine, led by a woman who refused a bow, and in doing so made the world stand.